An arrogant flight attendant picks on a quiet veteran during a flight. She doesn't know he has a heroic past and a mysterious briefcase. When the truth comes out, power shifts, and she faces unexpected consequences. A story about dignity, justice, and the true meaning of respect. The afternoon sun streamed through the oval windows of Sky Horizon Airways Flight 1782, illuminating the steady stream of passengers filing down the narrow aisle. Outside, the Atlanta tarmac shimmered with heat, ground crews scurrying between planes like ants on a mission. It was Tuesday, just another ordinary travel day for most of the people boarding the Washington, D.C.-bound aircraft. A businesswoman struggled with her oversized carry-on. A college student bobbed his head to inaudible music, and a young mother gently shushed her fussy toddler. The familiar choreography of air travel played out in predictable fashion. The shuffle for overhead bin space, the polite negotiations for seat swaps, the collective sigh when someone lingered too long in the aisle. At gate D23, the final boarding announcement crackled over the loudspeaker. Among the last passengers to approach was a black man in his late 50s. He moved with deliberate steps, his gait betraying the slightest asymmetry. Unlike the hurried travelers around him, he projected calm, the weathered tranquility of someone who had experienced far worse inconveniences than airport crowds. Marcus Johnson handed his boarding pass to the gate agent with a polite nod. He wore a simple navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, khaki slacks, and sensible walking shoes. Nothing about his appearance demanded attention except perhaps the perfect posture that seemed etched into his frame. In one hand, he carried a slim leather briefcase, standard business traveler fare, but in the other, he held something different. A brushed aluminum attaché case with reinforced corners and a sophisticated digital lock. He handled it with notable care, never letting it swing freely as he navigated the jetway. As he stepped onto the plane, Marcus glanced at his watch, a practical timepiece rather than a status symbol, and calculated the minutes until takeoff. His eyes, sharp and observant despite his age, took in every detail of his surroundings with practiced efficiency. For Marcus Johnson, retired Air Force colonel, situational awareness wasn't just a military skill, it was second nature. As Marcus made his way down the aisle, few passengers gave him a second glance. At 58, his close-cropped hair had long since turned salt and pepper, and deep laugh lines framed his expressive brown eyes. Years in the sun had weathered his dark skin, etching a roadmap of experiences across his face. He dressed like countless other middle-aged professionals. Nothing flashy, nothing that invited attention. Only the most observant might notice the small silver pin on his lapel, a subtle indication of military service that most civilians wouldn't recognize. Marcus preferred it that way. He'd never been one to advertise his accomplishments or demand recognition. His gait betrayed a slight irregularity, the legacy of an IED explosion outside Kandahar 7 years ago. The prosthetic left leg below his knee was a marvel of modern medical technology, hidden beneath his pant leg and custom-fitted to minimize his limp. On bad days, especially when storms were brewing, phantom pain would remind him of what he'd lost. Today was manageable, a 4 on his personal scale of discomfort. Marcus had mastered the art of navigating cramped spaces despite his prosthetic. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had adapted to his limitations without surrendering to them. His physical therapist had once remarked that his determination made other patients look lazy. Marcus had dismissed the compliment with a wave. "Just doing what needs doing," he'd said. Despite his unassuming appearance, there was something in his bearing that spoke of discipline and authority. It showed in the way he scanned his surroundings, in his economy of movement, in the precise way he stowed his leather briefcase. 32 years of military service had left their mark in ways no civilian career could. As he settled into his assigned seat, 1C, aisle, first row of economy, Marcus carefully placed his metal attaché case under the seat in front of him. He'd chosen this flight specifically for the extra legroom the bulkhead provided. Long flights with his prosthetic in standard economy seating had taught him painful lessons about circulation and comfort. He exchanged polite nods with an elderly gentleman across the aisle, then took out a dog-eared paperback, a biography of Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the first black general in the Air Force. Marcus opened to his bookmarked page and began reading, content with anonymity and the prospect of a quiet journey to the Capitol. Eleanor Wilson stalked down the aisle of the Boeing 737 like a general inspecting troops. At 42, she'd spent nearly half her life working for Sky Horizon Airways, and her seniority was evident in every sharp gesture and clipped instruction she barked at junior crew members. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated her angular features, and her uniform was impeccable, not a wrinkle or smudge to be found. "Sir, that bag is too large for overhead storage," she called out to a nervous-looking businessman. Before he could respond, she was already moving on. "Ma'am, you need to put your phone in airplane mode now, not when we take off." Her voice carried the practiced edge of someone who had spent years enforcing rules without needing to consider their purpose. A younger flight attendant, his name tag read Miguel, followed in Eleanor's wake like a cleanup crew, softening her abrupt commands with apologetic smiles and helpful suggestions. "Let me help you find space for that," he offered the businessman, while giving a reassuring nod to the woman with the phone. "Passengers never read the guidelines," Eleanor muttered loudly enough for several rows to hear. 15 years of the same rules, and they act surprised every single time. 12 years, corrected another flight attendant under her breath as she passed by with a stack of blankets. Eleanor shot her a withering look. "I don't need your commentary, Aisha. Just make sure 14D gets the wheelchair assistance they requested for deplaning." The cabin crew had developed a well-rehearsed dance around Eleanor's moods. When she approached the galley where 2 flight attendants were preparing the beverage cart, they immediately straightened up and busied themselves with inventory checks. "The coffee pots better be completely full this time," Eleanor said as she inspected their work. "Last flight to DC, we ran out halfway through service because someone didn't follow procedure." She emphasized the last word while staring pointedly at the younger of the 2 attendants. "Yes, Ms. Wilson," the young woman replied, eyes downcast. As Eleanor moved away, the senior attendant gave her colleague's arm a squeeze. "Don't let her get to you," she whispered. "Mercury must be in retrograde or something." Eleanor overheard and turned back sharply. "If you have time to discuss astrology, Jessica, you have time to recheck the emergency equipment." As the final passengers boarded, Eleanor's irritation seemed to intensify. She checked her watch repeatedly. Takeoff was scheduled in 20 minutes, and any delay would reflect poorly on the cabin crew's efficiency metrics. Her supervisor had already warned her about customer satisfaction scores that were consistently below average for her flights. "Let's move it along, people," she announced to the cabin at large. "We have a schedule to maintain." Marcus had just found his rhythm in the biography when a shadow fell across his page. He looked up to see Flight Attendant Wilson standing over him, her eyes fixed on the metal attaché case tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of him. "Sir, all baggage must be stowed in the overhead compartments for takeoff and landing," Eleanor stated flatly. Her tone suggested this was a rehearsed speech she'd delivered countless times. Marcus closed his book, keeping his place with one finger. "I understand, ma'am," he replied evenly, "but I have authorization to keep this particular case with me." He reached toward his inside jacket pocket. "I have the necessary documentation right here." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Documentation?" The skepticism in her voice was unmistakable. Across the aisle, an elderly gentleman with silver hair and a veteran's cap glanced over. His eyes widened slightly as he studied Marcus more carefully, a flash of recognition crossing his weathered features. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it and watched the interaction unfold. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus continued, his voice steady and respectful. "This case contains sensitive materials. The Department of Defense has issued specific guidelines for its transport." He extracted a folded document bearing official letterhead and Department of Defense seals. Eleanor barely glanced at the paper. "I've been flying this route for years, sir, and I'm well versed in FAA regulations. All items must be properly stowed during takeoff and landing. No exceptions." A young mother sitting behind Marcus shifted uncomfortably, sensing the brewing tension. Her toddler, oblivious to the adult dynamics at play, happily stacked plastic cups on his tray table. "I understand your concern for safety," Marcus said, his voice remaining level despite Eleanor's dismissive tone. "But this authorization comes directly from the Pentagon. The case is specially designed to fit under the seat without creating any obstruction." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Pentagon or not, on this aircraft, I'm responsible for ensuring all FAA regulations are followed. That case needs to go overhead or be checked." The elderly man across the aisle leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he began, "but I believe—" "One moment, sir." Eleanor cut him off without turning her head. "I'm addressing a safety concern with this passenger first." Marcus took a deep breath, the only sign that his patience might be wearing thin. "Perhaps we could discuss this with the captain. I've flown with this case dozens of times without issue." Eleanor's posture stiffened further. "The captain is preparing for takeoff. We don't disturb the flight deck for baggage disputes." She held out her hand expectantly. "Let me see that documentation again, please." The atmosphere in the front row had grown noticeably tense. Other passengers pretended not to listen while straining to catch every word. A businessman 2 rows back lowered his newspaper just enough to watch over its edge. Marcus handed over the document with deliberate calm. The paper crinkled slightly in Eleanor's grip as she finally examined it. Her lips pursed in concentration, or perhaps annoyance. The letterhead was unmistakable. Department of Defense, Office of the Secretary. Below that, official language authorized Colonel Marcus Johnson to maintain possession of classified materials during air travel, with specific mention of the security-cleared attaché case to remain in the passenger's direct control at all times. Eleanor's eyes flicked from the document to Marcus, then back again. For a moment, something like uncertainty crossed her features, but it quickly hardened into resolve. "This may be official-looking," she said, holding the paper by its corner as if it might contaminate her, "but airline safety protocols supersede other authorizations. I need to verify this with my supervisor." "By all means," Marcus replied evenly, "though I assure you it's authentic." The elderly gentleman across the aisle cleared his throat. "Excuse me, but if I might—" "Please remain in your seat, sir," Eleanor interrupted sharply, not even turning to acknowledge him. "This doesn't concern you." The old man's eyebrows rose, but he settled back, exchanging a knowing glance with Marcus. "Ma'am," Marcus continued, his voice still measured despite the growing tension, "perhaps I can explain further. This case contains classified documents for a Pentagon briefing tomorrow morning. I'm required by federal law to maintain possession of them at all times." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Mr. Johnson." "Colonel Johnson," he corrected gently. A flash of irritation crossed her face. "Colonel, then. I don't make exceptions to safety protocols, not even for military personnel. Rules exist for everyone's protection." By now, several passengers were openly watching the exchange. A middle-aged woman in business attire frowned at Eleanor's tone, while a college student had removed his earbuds to listen. "I understand your commitment to safety," Marcus said, "and I respect it. But this authorization was specifically designed to address those concerns. The case is reinforced, secured, and sized precisely to fit under the seat without creating any obstruction or hazard." Eleanor folded the document along its original creases with unnecessary precision. "If these materials are truly as important as you claim, the proper procedure would be to arrange secure military transport, not commercial air travel." A younger flight attendant, Miguel according to his name tag, approached cautiously. "Is everything okay up here, Eleanor? We're almost ready for departure." Eleanor handed him the document without looking. "Tell the captain we may have a compliance issue with 1C." Miguel glanced at the paper, then at Marcus, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. Not of Marcus personally, but of the significance of the document he now held. "Ma'am," Miguel began carefully, "this appears to be a standard DoD authorization. We've accommodated these before on government routes." Eleanor's head snapped toward him. "When you've worked this job as long as I have, you'll understand why we don't make exceptions based on fancy letterhead. Now, please deliver my message to the captain." Miguel hesitated, glancing apologetically at Marcus before retreating toward the cockpit. Eleanor turned back to Marcus, who remained composed despite the growing tension. The cabin had quieted noticeably, passengers in nearby rows now openly watching the confrontation unfold. "While we wait for confirmation," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed cabin, "I'll need you to place your case in the overhead compartment." Her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Marcus replied calmly. "As I explained, and as the documentation states, I'm required to maintain direct custody of these materials at all times." Eleanor's posture stiffened. "So, you're refusing to comply with flight crew instructions? You understand that's a federal violation, regardless of your military status?" A muscle twitched in Marcus's jaw, the first visible sign that her words had affected him. "I'm not refusing to comply with safety protocols. I'm following federal security protocols that supersede standard procedures in specific circumstances." Eleanor's voice rose slightly. "You think you're above the rules that everyone else follows? I deal with this attitude every day. People who believe they deserve special treatment." The racial undertone in her comment wasn't lost on those listening. A black woman seated nearby shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances with her husband. An older white couple whispered to each other, the woman shaking her head disapprovingly at Eleanor's behavior. "This isn't about special treatment," Marcus explained patiently. "It's about following proper procedures for classified materials. I've flown dozens of times with this case, and this is the first time it's been an issue." Eleanor leaned closer, lowering her voice but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "People like you always want exceptions. I've been dealing with entitled passengers for 12 years, and I'm tired of it. The rules apply to everyone, military or not." Marcus maintained his composure, though his eyes hardened slightly. "Ma'am, I'd appreciate it if you'd clarify what you mean by people like me." A few rows back, a young woman in her 20s had discreetly raised her phone, recording the interaction. Her seatmate gave her a subtle nod of approval. Eleanor noticed the phone and pointed sharply. "Electronic devices must be in airplane mode. Put that away immediately." Instead of complying, the young woman responded, "We haven't pushed back from the gate yet, and I'm not using data. FAA regulations allow device use until the safety briefing begins." Eleanor's face flushed. She turned back to Marcus, clearly frustrated by the loss of control over the situation. "This is completely unacceptable. If you cannot follow crew instructions, we may need to evaluate whether you can remain on this flight." The implied threat hung in the air. Marcus took a slow, measured breath. "I have no desire to create a disruption. I'm simply carrying out my duties as required by the Department of Defense. If you'd like to contact them directly for verification, I can provide the relevant phone numbers." By now, passengers throughout the cabin were paying attention, conversations fading as they watched the confrontation between the flight attendant and the quietly dignified man in seat 1C. Eleanor's patience visibly evaporated. With a swift motion that startled nearby passengers, she snatched the Department of Defense document from Marcus's hand. "This could easily be fabricated," she declared loudly enough for multiple rows to hear. "Do you have any idea how many passengers try to circumvent regulations with official papers? Last month, someone showed me a medical exemption printed from a template website." Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his posture straightened almost imperceptibly. A soldier at attention under fire. "Ma'am, that's a federal document. I'd appreciate if you'd handle it with care." Eleanor held the paper up to the light dramatically, as if checking for a watermark. "Probably purchased online. The internet has made it too easy for people to create fake credentials." The elderly veteran across the aisle could no longer contain himself. "Young lady, that is a United States military officer you're speaking to. Show some respect." Eleanor barely glanced at him. "Sir, please stay out of this. Airline regulations apply equally to everyone, military or civilian." Marcus cleared his throat. "The case contains sensitive materials related to national security. The documents are authorization from the Secretary of Defense's office confirming that I'm cleared to transport them on commercial flights. If these documents were truly that important, Eleanor replied with unconcealed skepticism. "You'd be on a military transport, not an economy class on a commercial flight." Her emphasis on economy class carried a distinct note of condescension. A quiet murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin. The young woman was still recording discreetly, her phone partially hidden behind an airline magazine. Marcus spoke softly but firmly. "Ma'am, that case contains documents pertaining to an intelligence briefing at the Pentagon tomorrow. I've been transporting sensitive materials this way for years without incident. If you'll return my authorization, we can verify its authenticity with your supervisor or the captain." Eleanor folded the document carelessly and tucked it into her uniform pocket. "We'll let security sort this out. Meanwhile, the case needs to go overhead." Marcus shook his head once, definitively. "I cannot relinquish custody of these materials. It would violate federal law and my direct orders." Eleanor's expression hardened. "So, you're admitting you're refusing to follow crew instructions?" "I'm following higher priority federal directives that supersede standard airline protocols," Marcus explained with remarkable patience. "This isn't a matter of preference. It's a matter of national security protocol." By now, the public humiliation was complete. Every passenger within earshot was witnessing Eleanor's treatment of a man who, despite her provocations, maintained exceptional composure. The contrast between her escalating behavior and his dignity was striking. A middle-aged woman several rows back stood up. "This is ridiculous. Leave the man alone. He's clearly not causing any problems." "Please return to your seat, ma'am," Eleanor snapped without looking away from Marcus. "Interference with crew duties is also a federal offense." The woman sat down reluctantly, exchanging outraged glances with her seatmate. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. Eleanor stood over Marcus, her arms crossed, while he remained seated, one hand resting protectively on his attaché case. The standoff had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the forward cabin. "Final warning," Eleanor declared. "Either place your case in the overhead bin, or I'll need to call security to remove you from this flight." Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his eyes conveyed the weariness of someone who had faced far worse confrontations. "I've explained my position and provided the necessary documentation. I cannot and will not surrender custody of classified materials." Eleanor's patience finally snapped. She reached down and grasped the handle of the metal attaché case. "Then I'll move it myself." What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds. Marcus instinctively secured the case with a firm grip, preventing Eleanor from lifting it. In the process, her arm knocked against his lapel, dislodging the small military service pin. It fell to the floor with a barely audible ping, rolling under the seat. The cabin grew utterly silent. Even the ambient sounds of the aircraft seemed to fade as passengers held their collective breath. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus's calm exterior cracked slightly. He straightened in his seat, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that seemed to fill the cabin without rising in volume. "Ms. Wilson," he said deliberately, using her name from her identification badge, "with all due respect, you are not authorized to touch this case. I am under direct orders from the Department of Defense to maintain custody of these materials at all times. By attempting to remove them from my possession, you are interfering with federal duties." The shift in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't angry bluster or indignation. It was the voice of command, of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. Eleanor stepped back, visibly startled by the transformation. Her momentary uncertainty quickly gave way to defensive anger. "Did you just threaten me?" she demanded loudly. "Did everyone hear that? He just threatened a member of the flight crew." The elderly veteran across the aisle shook his head in disgust. "That wasn't a threat, young lady. That was a statement of fact." A flight attendant named Miguel had been hovering nearby, watching the situation deteriorate with growing concern. He stepped forward hesitantly. "Eleanor, maybe we should—" "Call the captain," she interrupted sharply, "and security. This passenger is being aggressive and refusing to comply with safety regulations." Marcus slowly bent down, retrieving his fallen service pin from the floor. As he straightened, the movement caused a momentary wince. a brief reminder of the physical cost his military service had extracted. "I have not raised my voice," Marcus said calmly. "I have not been aggressive. I have simply maintained custody of materials I am required by law to protect. If that constitutes a threat in your mind, perhaps we should discuss this with your superior." Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "Oh, we certainly will be discussing this with someone in authority. You can explain to airport security why you think military credentials give you the right to disobey safety regulations and threaten airline staff." Eleanor pressed the intercom button on the nearby phone, her movements sharp with vindictive energy. "Captain, we have a situation in row 1. Passenger refusing to comply with safety protocols and becoming confrontational. We need security at the forward door immediately." She released the button before any response could come through, a smug smile spreading across her face as she turned back to Marcus. "Security will escort you off the aircraft shortly," she announced, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "Next time, perhaps consider that your military status doesn't exempt you from following the same rules as everyone else." The cabin had grown oppressively quiet. Even passengers who had been absorbed in books or devices were now fully attuned to the drama unfolding in the first row. A sense of collective discomfort permeated the aircraft, the unsettling feeling of witnessing an injustice without knowing how to intervene. Marcus remained composed, his hands folded neatly on his lap, the metal attaché case secured firmly between his feet. Nothing in his demeanor suggested concern about Eleanor's threats. "I understand you're doing what you believe is right," he said quietly. "I hold no ill will toward you for that." His measured response seemed to irritate Eleanor further. She had expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps even fear, not this unflappable calm. It denied her the emotional leverage she sought. "Save it for security," she replied dismissively. "I've seen every excuse in the book during my career. Your attitude is exactly why we have these protocols in the first place." The young woman who had been recording the interaction caught Marcus's eye briefly. She gave him a subtle nod of solidarity before slipping her phone into her pocket. The footage was already saved. Eleanor paced in front of the first row, periodically checking her watch and glancing toward the aircraft door. "Any minute now," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Her anticipation was palpable, the satisfaction of order being restored, of authority being reinforced. The elderly veteran across the aisle leaned toward Marcus. "This is disgraceful," he said under his breath. "In my day—" "It's all right," Marcus interrupted gently. "Some battles aren't worth fighting." Eleanor overheard the exchange and turned sharply. "There are no battles here, sir, just regulations that protect everyone's safety. Perhaps if your friend had simply complied from the beginning, we'd be preparing for takeoff now instead of waiting for security." Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A mother pulled her curious child closer, whispering something in his ear that made him stop staring at the confrontation. Miguel, the younger flight attendant, approached Eleanor with visible reluctance. "Eleanor, the captain is coming out to assess the situation personally," he said quietly. A flash of surprise crossed Eleanor's face, quickly replaced by satisfaction. "Good. He'll back me up on this. Safety protocols are non-negotiable." Marcus straightened his jacket and reattached his service pin to his lapel, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Despite Eleanor's confidence, he showed no signs of concern about the captain's imminent arrival. "I've never had an issue with this case on dozens of flights," he remarked to no one in particular. "Interesting that today would be different." The cockpit door opened with a pneumatic hiss, drawing all eyes forward. Captain William Richards emerged, his commanding presence immediately filling the space. At 62, he carried himself with the dignified authority that came from decades of flying commercial aircraft after an earlier career in the Air Force. His uniform was impeccable, 4 gold stripes gleaming on each shoulder. Eleanor's posture straightened as she stepped forward to meet him. "Captain, thank you for coming. We have a passenger refusing to comply with baggage regulations and becoming confrontational when instructed to follow procedure." Captain Richards nodded once, his expression professionally neutral. "I understand, Miss Wilson. What's the specific issue?" Eleanor gestured toward Marcus. "This passenger insists on keeping a metal case at his feet rather than stowing it properly. He claims it contains classified documents and has produced what he says is Department of Defense authorization. She reached into her pocket and extended the folded document toward the captain. I was explaining that regardless of any special status he believes he has, FAA safety regulations apply to everyone on board. Captain Richards accepted the document and carefully unfolded it. As his eyes scanned the contents, his professional mask slipped momentarily. He looked up sharply, focusing on Marcus for the first time since entering the cabin. A heavy silence fell as the captain studied the seated man with growing recognition. The change in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. A straightening of his already perfect posture, a slight widening of his eyes. Richards took 2 measured steps toward Marcus, his gaze never wavering. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of respect that contrasted sharply with Eleanor's previous tone. "Colonel Johnson?" Marcus nodded once, his expression remaining neutral. The captain's face transformed with a mix of surprise and unmistakable respect. "Sir, I had no idea you were on our manifest today." He extended his hand. "It's an honor to have you aboard." Marcus rose with a slight effort, the first indication of his prosthetic leg, and shook the captain's hand firmly. "The honor is mine, Captain. Sorry about the confusion." Eleanor stared between them, her mouth slightly agape as her expected scenario crumbled. "You know each other?" Captain Richards turned toward her, his expression now stern. "Ms. Wilson, do you have any idea who you've been confronting?" Eleanor's confidence faltered visibly. He claimed to be military, but many passengers exaggerate their— "Colonel Marcus Johnson isn't exaggerating anything," the captain interrupted, his voice low but carrying the weight of the authority. "And this authorization," he held up the document, "is absolutely legitimate. I've seen dozens like it during my years flying government routes." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted palpably. Passengers who had been watching the confrontation with quiet discomfort now leaned forward with renewed interest, sensing the dramatic reversal unfolding before them. Miguel, the younger flight attendant, had remained nearby. Unlike Eleanor, his expression showed a dawning recognition. "Wait, Colonel Johnson, as in—" Captain Richards nodded grimly. "Exactly." Captain Richards positioned himself strategically between Eleanor and Marcus, his body language making it clear which side of the confrontation commanded his respect. He handed the authorization document back to Marcus with a deferent nod. "Colonel Johnson, my sincere apologies for this misunderstanding," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed cabin. "Your documentation is in perfect order. The case can remain exactly where it is." Eleanor's face flushed with a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. "Captain, with all due respect, FAA regulations clearly state—" "Ms. Wilson," the captain interrupted firmly, "the Department of Defense authorization supersedes standard protocol in this specific circumstance. This is not a matter for debate." Marcus raised a hand slightly. "I appreciate your intervention, Captain, but there's no need for concern. I understand Ms. Wilson is simply trying to follow procedure." The captain shook his head, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered features. "Colonel, your graciousness is noted, but completely unnecessary." He turned to address the first few rows of now wrapped passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We'll be pushing back from the gate momentarily." Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice to an urgent whisper. "Captain, I still don't understand why we're making an exception to safety protocols. Who, exactly, is this passenger?" Captain Richards studied her with barely concealed disbelief. "You really don't know?" When her expression remained blank, he sighed heavily. "Colonel Marcus Johnson is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration. He saved an entire platoon during an ambush in Afghanistan, despite losing his leg in the process." Eleanor's eyes widened, flickering briefly to Marcus's leg before returning to the captain's stern gaze. The color drained from her face as the implications of her behavior began to dawn on her. The elderly veteran across the aisle nodded in solemn confirmation. "I thought I recognized you, sir," he said to Marcus. "Your picture hangs in the VA hospital where I get treatment. It's an honor to share this flight with you." Several nearby passengers murmured in recognition, the name finally registering. A young serviceman seated a few rows back straightened instinctively, the ingrained respect for the Medal of Honor transcending the casual setting of a commercial flight. Marcus acknowledged the veteran with a respectful nod but seemed uncomfortable with the attention now directed his way. "I was just doing my job," he said quietly, "like we all were." Captain Richards turned back to Eleanor, his voice low but firm. "The colonel is en route to a classified briefing at the Pentagon. That case contains materials he is legally required to maintain in his personal custody at all times. His documentation is not only legitimate, but carries the highest possible authorization." Eleanor's professional demeanor had completely disintegrated. She stood frozen, the magnitude of her error rendering her momentarily speechless. The captain continued, "Colonel Johnson has more than earned any accommodation we can provide. More importantly, his authorization is legitimate and binding. The case stays with him." A ripple of approval moved through the watching passengers. The young woman who had been recording earlier caught Marcus's eye and gave him a subtle thumbs up. Captain Richards rested one hand on the back of the empty seat beside Marcus, his posture relaxed but his expression serious as he addressed Eleanor. "Perhaps you're not familiar with Colonel Johnson's service record," he began, his tone measured. 7 years ago, outside Kandahar, the colonel was leading a transport convoy when they were ambushed by insurgents. The lead vehicle was disabled by an IED, and they were pinned down under heavy fire. Eleanor stood rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as the captain continued. With their communications jammed and casualties mounting, Colonel Johnson coordinated a defensive position. When a secondary explosion set one vehicle ablaze with 3 wounded soldiers trapped inside, he personally extracted each one despite being exposed to enemy fire. The cabin had grown utterly silent. Even passengers who had been ignoring the confrontation were now listening intently. The last soldier he pulled from the burning vehicle was unconscious. While carrying him to safety, Colonel Johnson stepped on another IED. The captain's voice grew slightly hoarse. It took his left leg below the knee. Despite catastrophic blood loss and his own injuries, he applied a tourniquet to his leg and continued directing the defense until air support arrived. Marcus stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable as his actions were recounted. This wasn't the first time he'd heard his story told by others, but it clearly wasn't something he sought or enjoyed. 30 soldiers returned home to their families because of his actions that day, the captain concluded quietly. The president himself presented the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony. Eleanor's eyes darted between the captain and Marcus, the full weight of her misjudgment now evident on her face. "I didn't know," she managed weakly. "Clearly," the captain replied, his disappointment evident, but even without knowing his background, his documentation was in order. "The Department of Defense authorization you dismissed is signed by the Secretary of Defense personally." A young mother seated nearby caught Marcus's eye and mouthed a silent, "Thank you for your service." He acknowledged her with a modest nod. "The contents of that case," the captain continued, gesturing toward the metal attaché, "are classified materials for a Pentagon intelligence briefing tomorrow morning. Colonel Johnson is required by federal law to maintain physical custody of those documents at all times. That's not a preference or a convenience. It's a matter of national security." Eleanor's professional composure had completely crumbled. "I was just trying to follow safety protocols," she said, her voice barely audible. "Safety is indeed our priority," Captain Richards agreed, "which is why there are established procedures for accommodating secure materials on commercial flights. The colonel's case is specially designed to fit under the seat without creating any obstruction or hazard. It poses no safety risk whatsoever." The irony was not lost on the watching passengers. Eleanor's insistence on the attaché case being a safety issue had created the only actual disruption to the flight's safety and schedule. "Furthermore," the captain added, lowering his voice slightly, "the behavior you exhibited toward a distinguished veteran and Medal of Honor recipient reflects poorly not just on you, but on our entire airline." By now, the silent judgment of the cabin had become palpable. Passengers exchanged meaningful glances, their verdict on the situation clear in their expressions. As understanding of Marcus's identity spread through the cabin, the atmosphere transformed from tense discomfort to something approaching reverence. Passengers who moments earlier had been reluctant to intervene now seemed eager to distance themselves from Eleanor's behavior and align with the quiet dignity Marcus had displayed throughout the confrontation. A young woman in Air Force dress blues, seated several rows back, rose to her feet and came to attention, offering a crisp salute. "Colonel Johnson, Second Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, sir. It's an honor to be on this flight with you." Marcus returned the salute with precision that belied his years away from active duty. "At ease, Lieutenant. The honor is mine." The public acknowledgement seemed to open a floodgate. A middle-aged man leaned across the aisle. "My son serves in the Air Force, sir. Men like you are the reason he wanted to join. I saw your ceremony on television," another passenger called out. "What you did in Afghanistan was extraordinary." Each comment seemed to make Marcus increasingly uncomfortable with the attention, though he acknowledged each person with genuine gratitude. His humility in the face of their praise only served to highlight the contrast between his character and Eleanor's earlier behavior. The elderly veteran who had attempted to intervene earlier made his way carefully to Marcus's seat, leaning heavily on a cane. "Korea, 1952, he said simply, extending a weathered hand. Marcus rose immediately, shaking the man's hand with evident respect. "Thank you for your service, sir." "No, son," the older man replied, his voice cracking slightly. "Thank you for yours." Eleanor remained frozen in place, her face a mask of mortification as she witnessed the rolling wave of recognition. Every accolade directed at Marcus was an implicit rebuke of her actions. She attempted to interject. "I had no idea." "That's becoming increasingly clear." Captain Richards cut her off quietly. A murmur continued to spread throughout the cabin as passengers shared information about Marcus with those who hadn't overheard the captain's explanation. Smartphones appeared as people searched his name, expressions of awe following each discovery. He saved 30 soldiers, lost his leg pulling men from a burning vehicle. The president gave him the Medal of Honor. The whispers transformed into a soft ripple of applause that grew steadily louder. Marcus looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the recognition but touched nonetheless. Eleanor tried once more to salvage the situation. "Colonel Johnson, if I had known about your distinguished service—" "It shouldn't matter," interrupted a businesswoman from row 3, loud enough for many to hear. "You shouldn't need to know someone's a hero to treat them with basic respect." Murmurs of agreement spread through the cabin. The public sentiment had shifted decidedly against Eleanor, and each passing moment made her position more untenable. Captain Richards placed a hand gently on Marcus's shoulder. "Colonel, I apologize again for this disruption. We'll be underway shortly." He turned to Eleanor, his expression leaving no room for argument. "Ms. Wilson, I need to speak with you privately. Now." As Eleanor followed the captain toward the galley, the buzz of conversation continued. The story of what had transpired was already traveling to the back of the plane, passengers turning in their seats to catch a glimpse of the humble hero in 1C. Captain Richards led Eleanor to the forward galley, his back straight and shoulders squared with unmistakable military bearing. Though he kept his voice low, the tension in his posture was evident to everyone watching. "What happened out there is completely unacceptable," he began, his words measured but firm. "Not only did you disregard valid federal documentation, but you escalated a non-issue into a confrontation with a decorated war hero." Eleanor's professional facade had completely crumbled. "Captain, I was just trying to enforce safety protocols. How was I supposed to know who he was?" "That's precisely the point," Richards replied. "You don't know the circumstances of every passenger, which is why we're trained to handle situations with respect and verification protocols, not assumptions and accusations." Behind them, Miguel was preparing the beverage cart, pretending not to listen while catching every word. The other flight attendants busied themselves with pre-flight preparations, exchanging knowing glances as the captain continued his reprimand. In the main cabin, Marcus had returned to his book, seemingly eager to escape the attention. However, passengers continued to approach him respectfully, offering handshakes and words of gratitude. He acknowledged each one with genuine humility. The young woman who had been recording discreetly approached a fellow passenger. "I got the whole thing," she whispered, showing her phone screen. "It's already uploaded. My brother works at Veterans Affairs. He's going to make sure this gets seen." Captain Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened further. "This situation has already escalated beyond this aircraft," he informed Eleanor. "I've just received a message from operations. The video of your interaction with Colonel Johnson is circulating on social media." Eleanor blanched. "Video? Someone was recording? In an aircraft full of smartphones?" "Of course they were," Richards replied. "And now corporate headquarters is involved. They're pulling up Colonel Johnson's profile and his extensive travel history with our airline." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as the implications became clear. "What does that mean? For the flight? For me?" Before the captain could respond, his phone buzzed again with an incoming call. "Richards," he answered crisply. He listened for several moments, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Understood. Yes, I'll handle it immediately." He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. "That was the Chief Operations Officer," he informed Eleanor, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The decision has been made. You will not be working this flight." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. We're already behind schedule and you'd be down a crew member." "We'll manage," Richards replied firmly. "This comes directly from executive level. A ground team is already on their way to the aircraft. You're to collect your personal items and deplane immediately." The reality of the situation finally seemed to hit Eleanor fully. "This is ridiculous. One misunderstanding and my 12 years of service mean nothing?" Captain Richards leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "This isn't about one misunderstanding. It's about judgment, professionalism, and representing our airline. The way you handled this situation demonstrated a serious lack of all three." Through the galley curtain, they could see two ground staff in Sky Horizon Airways uniforms approaching the aircraft door. One carried a clipboard while the other spoke into a radio. "Your replacement is already on the way," Richards informed her. "This is happening, Eleanor. How it happens is up to you, with dignity or without." Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, processing the surreal turn of events. Just 15 minutes ago, she had been enforcing her authority. Now she was being removed from her own flight. "This isn't over," she whispered, more to herself than to the captain. "He should have just followed the rules like everyone else." Richards shook his head sadly. "He was following rules. Higher-level federal regulations that supersede our standard protocols. That's what you failed to understand, even when presented with the documentation." The ground staff had boarded the aircraft now, scanning the cabin until they spotted the captain and Eleanor in the galley. The lead ground staff member, a woman in her 40s with an authoritative presence, approached Eleanor and Captain Richards in the galley. Her name badge identified her as Diane Matthews, station manager. "Ms. Wilson," she inquired, though it was clearly a formality. She knew exactly who Eleanor was. "I need you to gather your personal belongings and come with me, please." Eleanor stared at her in disbelief. "You're really doing this? Removing me from my own flight over a baggage dispute?" Diane's expression remained professionally neutral. "This isn't about a baggage dispute, Ms. Wilson. It's about your handling of a situation involving a distinguished passenger with proper federal authorization." By now, most passengers were aware something significant was happening. They watched with undisguised interest as the drama continued to unfold at the front of the aircraft. "You need to come with us now," Diane continued, her tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "A replacement flight attendant is already on her way to take your position. The flight will depart as soon as the crew change is complete." Eleanor's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "I've worked for this airline for 12 years. You can't just—" "Ms. Wilson," Diane interrupted, using Eleanor's own clipped professional tone. "All baggage handlers must follow proper protocols. No exceptions." The deliberate echo of Eleanor's earlier words to Marcus was not lost on those listening. A ripple of barely suppressed satisfaction passed through the nearby passengers. The poetic justice of Eleanor being removed for failing to follow proper protocols, The very accusation she had leveled at Marcus was too perfect to ignore. "You can either exit the aircraft with dignity," Diane continued quietly, "or we can escalate this situation further. The choice is yours, but it will be made in the next 60 seconds. Eleanor glanced around desperately, perhaps hoping to find an ally among her fellow crew members. Miguel kept his eyes down, busying himself with napkin counts. The other flight attendants found sudden interest in their pre-flight checklists. Marcus, still seated in 1C, appeared engrossed in his book, deliberately avoiding the spectacle that was unfolding partly because of him. His dignified disengagement from Eleanor's humiliation spoke volumes about his character. "This is absurd," Eleanor hissed, but there was defeat in her voice now. "You're taking his side without even hearing mine." "We have heard your side," Diane replied evenly, "from multiple sources. The videos are quite clear." "Videos? Plural," Eleanor whispered, the color draining from her face. Diane nodded once. "At least 3 different angles are circulating online. The hashtag #SheChooseAmerican. Airlines, shame is trending. Corporate communications is already preparing a statement." The public relations nightmare was rapidly expanding beyond the confines of the aircraft. What had started as a petty power play by Eleanor had transformed into a social media firestorm that threatened the airline's reputation. With a final, desperate glance around the cabin, Eleanor retrieved her small roller bag from the crew storage area. "This isn't fair," she muttered. "I was just doing my job." "No," Diane replied quietly. "You were exceeding your authority and dismissing valid federal documentation. That's not your job." As Eleanor moved toward the exit, she had to pass directly by Marcus's seat. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Marcus offered a small, dignified nod. Not gloating, not vindictive, just a simple acknowledgement of her humanity despite everything that had transpired. That simple gesture of grace seemed to affect Eleanor more deeply than all the reprimands. She quickly looked away, her rigid posture crumbling slightly as the reality of her situation fully dawned on her. Eleanor's walk of shame down the aisle felt interminable. Though it took only seconds to reach the aircraft door, each step seemed to stretch in time as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes following her progress. Passengers who had witnessed her treatment of Marcus watched with barely concealed satisfaction. Some exchanged knowing glances or subtle nods of approval at the justice being served. Others simply stared, their silent judgment more damning than any verbal criticism could have been. "Excuse me," a middle-aged woman said pointedly as Eleanor passed her row, forcing the flight attendant to step sideways in the narrow aisle. The small obstruction was clearly deliberate, a minor power play mirroring Eleanor's earlier behavior. Near the middle of the aircraft, a businessman who had missed the original confrontation leaned toward his seatmate. "What's happening?" he whispered loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "Flight attendant tried to bully a Medal of Honor recipient," came the equally audible reply. "Guess who lost that battle?" A flush of humiliation crept up Eleanor's neck as she quickened her pace. Each row seemed to bring a new indignity. A whispered comment, a disapproving headshake, or worst of all, the deliberate turning away of heads as if she were no longer worthy of acknowledgement. As she approached the exit, Eleanor made one last desperate attempt to salvage her dignity. She turned to Diane, keeping her voice low. "This is a complete overreaction. I've never had a complaint filed against me in 12 years. Diane's expression remained professionally neutral. "Actually, Ms. Wilson, your file contains 17 passenger complaints over the past 2 years alone. This incident merely brought them into sharper focus." The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She had always dismissed passenger complaints as the entitled whining of travelers who didn't understand airline procedures. Now, those accumulated grievances had returned with devastating consequence. At the aircraft door, Eleanor turned for one final look at the cabin, her domain for so many years, now the site of her most profound professional humiliation. From his seat in 1C, Marcus had returned to his book, seemingly uninterested in witnessing her disgrace. His quiet dignity only highlighted the pettiness of her earlier behavior. "Your replacement will be here momentarily," Diane informed her, gesturing toward the jetway where another uniformed flight attendant was already approaching. We'll need your ID badge and security credentials before you leave." The final indignity, surrendering the symbols of her authority and position, left Eleanor momentarily speechless. With trembling fingers, she unpinned her wings and name badge, dropping them into Diane's outstretched hand. As she stepped onto the jetway, the aircraft door closed behind her with a decisive pneumatic hiss, sealing her off from the world she had inhabited just minutes before. Through the small window, she could see passengers already settling back into their routines, the disruption she had caused rapidly fading into travel anecdotes they would share upon reaching their destinations. 2 security officers waited at the end of the jetway. "Ms. Wilson, we'll escort you to the administrative offices," one of them stated. It wasn't a request. As they walked through the terminal, Eleanor became acutely aware of the stares from other travelers. Had news of the incident spread so quickly? Or was it simply the unusual sight of a uniformed flight attendant being escorted by security? Either way, her 12-year career seemed to be crumbling with each step away from the aircraft. The realization hit her with devastating clarity. In attempting to assert her authority over Marcus Johnson, she had lost everything that gave her that authority in the first place. Back on the aircraft, a palpable sense of relief spread through the cabin as a new flight attendant took Eleanor's place. The replacement, a woman in her late 30s with a warm smile, immediately set a different tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Janelle, and I'll be serving as your lead flight attendant today. We apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience. We'll be pushing back from the gate momentarily." Captain Richards emerged briefly from the cockpit, conferring quietly with his crew before addressing the cabin. "Folks, sorry for the unexpected staff change. We'll be on our way to D.C. in just a few minutes. Current flying time is 2 hours and 7 minutes with clear skies all the way." As the crew prepared for departure, Janelle approached Marcus's seat with a respectful demeanor entirely different from Eleanor's confrontational stance. "Colonel Johnson," she said quietly, "on behalf of Sky Horizon Airways, I want to personally apologize for your experience today. It in no way reflects our values or how we aim to treat any passenger, especially someone of your distinguished service." Marcus looked up from his book with a small smile. "No apology necessary. These things happen. Nevertheless," Janelle continued, "our CEO would like to speak with you when you land in Washington. He's deeply concerned about the incident." Marcus shook his head slightly. "That's really not necessary. I'd prefer to let the matter drop." "Of course," Janelle nodded, respecting his wish. "Can I bring you anything before takeoff? Water? Coffee?" "Water would be fine, thank you." As Janelle moved away, the elderly veteran across the aisle leaned toward Marcus. "You're being too generous. That woman was completely out of line." Marcus considered this for a moment. "Everyone has bad days. 12 years of service shouldn't end over one mistake." "That's more mercy than she showed you," the veteran observed. Marcus shrugged. "Mercy isn't earned. Otherwise, it wouldn't be mercy." He tapped the cover of his book thoughtfully. "Besides, I've seen enough conflict in my life. No need to create more where it isn't necessary." The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, nearly 30 minutes behind schedule. As the engine spooled up, a subtle shift seemed to occur within the cabin. A collective exhale as the tension of the earlier confrontation dissipated. Captain Richards' voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." Janelle moved efficiently through the cabin, her professionalism tinged with genuine warmth. Where Eleanor had projected rigid authority, Janelle exuded competent service. The contrast wasn't lost on the passengers who had witnessed both approaches. As they taxied toward the runway, Marcus gazed out the window at the Atlanta skyline. The metal attaché case, the source of so much unnecessary conflict, remained securely at his feet where it had been all along. A young flight attendant, Miguel, approached with a bottle of water. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I wanted to say I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I should have intervened." Marcus accepted the water with a nod of thanks. "You were in a difficult position. Hierarchy is important in organizations for a reason. Don't be too hard on yourself." "Still," Miguel persisted, "what you did in Afghanistan, we all owe you more than that kind of treatment." Marcus smiled slightly. "What I did in Afghanistan was my job. What you do here is yours." We all serve in different ways." The simple exchange seemed to lift a weight from the young man's shoulders. He straightened slightly, his professional demeanor returning with newfound confidence. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, the incident began to transform from a confrontation into a story, one that would be retold in living rooms and over dinner tables across the country by tomorrow. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the normal rhythm of flight service began. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, and passengers started to move about the cabin. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by the peculiar temporary community that forms among strangers sharing a journey. Janelle moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but unlike Eleanor's mechanical adherence to procedure, her service carried genuine warmth. When she reached Marcus's row with the beverage cart, she offered a respectful smile. "Can I get you anything to drink, Colonel?" "Just water's fine, thank you," Marcus replied. As she poured his drink, a young boy of about 8 peered around his mother from the seat behind. He'd been watching Marcus with undisguised curiosity since the confrontation. "Are you really a soldier?" the boy asked, his voice carrying that distinctive lack of volume control that comes with childhood. His mother immediately shushed him. "Tyler, that's not polite." Marcus turned slightly in his seat, offering the boy a gentle smile. "It's okay. Yes, I was a soldier. Air Force, actually." The boy's eyes widened. "Did you fly planes?" "Sometimes," Marcus replied, "but mostly I helped make sure other people could do their jobs safely." Tyler seemed to consider this carefully. "My dad's in the Army. He's in a place called Afghanistan, Marcus supplied quietly. The mother looked at Marcus apologetically. "He's been deployed for 7 months now." Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. He turned more fully toward the boy. "Afghanistan is a tough place. Your dad is very brave to be there." "He says he's not brave. He's just doing his job," Tyler replied earnestly. A genuine smile spread across Marcus's face. "That's exactly what brave people say." The boy beamed at this insight into his father's character. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper. "I drew this for when we pick up my dad next month. Do you think he'll like it?" The drawing showed a stick figure in camouflage standing beside what appeared to be an American flag. In a child's uneven lettering, it read, "My Dad, the Hero." Marcus studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "This is excellent work. He's going to love it." Tyler's face lit up with pride. After a moment's hesitation, he tore a blank page from his sketchbook and offered it to Marcus. "Could you draw something too? Then I can show Dad I met a real hero." The mother began to object, but Marcus waved away her concern. "I'd be honored, though I should warn you. My artistic skills are limited to tactical diagrams and map coordinates." For the next several minutes, Marcus helped Tyler create a new drawing, showing an aircraft flying over mountains with small figures giving thumbs-up signs below. The simple interaction drew smiles from nearby passengers, a moment of genuine human connection emerging from the earlier conflict. Across the aisle, the elderly veteran watched the exchange with approval. "You're good with kids," he observed. Marcus shrugged slightly. "They ask honest questions and accept honest answers. There's something refreshing about that." Further down the aisle, a young woman in military uniform had been watching the interaction. She approached carefully, standing at a respectful distance. "Excuse me, Colonel Johnson. I'm Lieutenant Martinez. I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet you. We still study your Kandahar extraction at the Academy." Marcus extended his hand. "The honor is mine, Lieutenant. How long have you been serving?" 3 years, sir. Transport Division." She hesitated, then added, "What happened earlier? I should have spoken up." Marcus shook his head firmly. "You were a passenger, not in uniform. Not your responsibility. Still, sir, after everything you've—" "The past is the past, Lieutenant," Marcus interrupted gently. "Today is just another day." His humility seemed to affect her deeply. She nodded once, crisp and military, before returning to her seat. As the interactions unfolded, Janelle observed from the galley with a colleague. "That's how you handle a VIP," she murmured. "Eleanor never understood that respect works better than authority." The remainder of the beverage service continued without incident. the cabin settling into the peaceful monotony of mid-flight. The earlier confrontation had transformed from a tense standoff into a story with a satisfying resolution, a rare thing in a world where conflicts often lingered without clear conclusion. As the aircraft began its initial descent toward Washington, D.C., Captain Richards' voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach into Reagan National Airport. Current weather in D.C. is 72 degrees with clear skies. Local time is 4:15 p.m. We should be at the gate in about 25 minutes." He paused briefly before continuing, his tone shifting subtly. "Before we land, I'd like to take a moment to thank you all for your patience with our delayed departure today. I'd also like to acknowledge that we have the privilege of carrying a distinguished passenger with us, a recipient of our nation's highest military honor. On behalf of everyone at Sky Horizon Airways, we're honored to have you aboard, Colonel Johnson." A spontaneous round of applause broke out in the cabin. Marcus looked down at his book, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but appreciative nonetheless. From the window seats, passengers could see the iconic monuments of the nation's capital coming into view. The Washington Monument stretching skyward, the Capitol dome gleaming in the afternoon sun. The landscape below represented the very institutions and ideals that Marcus had risked his life to protect. The elderly veteran across the aisle leaned toward Marcus. "Quite a city, isn't it? Still gives me goosebumps after all these years?" Marcus nodded in agreement. "Every time." "I heard you're headed to the Pentagon," the veteran continued. "More ceremonies?" "Something like that," Marcus replied vaguely, his hand resting protectively on his attaché case. The veteran seemed to understand the discretion. "Well, whatever it is, I'm glad men like you are involved." He gestured toward the window. "All that marble and monument making doesn't mean much without people willing to stand behind it." As the aircraft descended through 10,000 feet, passengers began stowing electronic devices and returning seatbacks to their upright positions. The confrontation with Eleanor now seemed like a distant memory, though several passengers were checking their phones one last time, likely viewing the videos that had already gone viral. "Look at this," a businessman said to his seatmate, showing his screen. "The story's trending nationally. Sky Horizon Airways has already issued a statement apologizing to Colonel Johnson and affirming their commitment to proper treatment of military personnel." In the galley, Janelle was preparing for landing when her phone buzzed with a message from another crew member. She read it quickly, her eyebrows rising in surprise. As the aircraft made its final approach, she made her way to Marcus's seat and leaned down slightly. "Colonel Johnson, I thought you might want to know. The incident has gained significant attention. Ms. Wilson has been suspended pending review, and our CEO has issued a personal apology." Marcus frowned slightly. "The suspension seems excessive. Everyone makes mistakes." Janelle looked surprised by his response. "That's very generous of you, sir." Marcus shrugged. "I've seen what happens when people become casualties of public opinion. It rarely ends with understanding." The conversation was cut short as the aircraft touched down with a gentle bump, tires chirping against the runway. As they taxied toward the terminal, passengers began the familiar ritual of retrieving items and preparing to deplane. Through the windows, they could see the regular activities of the airport: ground crews positioning equipment, baggage handlers preparing to unload the cargo hold, other aircraft taxiing to and from gates. The ordinary mechanics of air travel continued, unchanged by the drama that had unfolded aboard this particular flight. Yet, for those who had witnessed the confrontation between Marcus and Eleanor, something had shifted. A reminder, perhaps, that beneath the routines and regulations of daily life lay deeper questions about authority, respect, and the often invisible sacrifices made by those who serve. The aircraft docked at Gate 35 with a gentle bump. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers rose in the familiar choreography of deplaning, retrieving bags from overhead bins, checking seats for forgotten items, forming the inevitable queue in the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Reagan National Airport," Janelle announced. "Please use caution when opening overhead bins as items may have shifted during flight. On behalf of Captain Richards and our entire crew, thank you for flying Sky Horizon Airways." As the first-row passenger, Marcus would normally be among the first to deplane. Instead, he remained seated, allowing others to move ahead while he gathered his belongings unhurriedly. The metal attaché case, the catalyst for so much drama, remained securely at his feet until the aisle began to clear. Miguel, the young flight attendant, approached as the crowd thinned. "Colonel Johnson, there's a Pentagon representative waiting for you at the gate." Marcus nodded his thanks. "I appreciate your professionalism today," he told the young man. "You handled a difficult situation with grace." Miguel appeared genuinely touched by the compliment. "That means a lot coming from you, sir." The elderly veteran paused beside Marcus's seat on his way out. "Been thinking about what happened with that flight attendant," he said, leaning on his cane. "Reminds me of something my commanding officer said in Korea. The measure of a person isn't how they treat their superiors, but how they handle those they perceive as beneath them." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Wise words." "Take care of yourself, Colonel," the veteran said, offering a handshake. "And that leg, too." As the cabin emptied, Captain Richards emerged from the cockpit, making his way directly to Marcus. "Colonel, I wanted to apologize personally for the experience you had aboard our aircraft today." Marcus rose to his feet, attaché case now in hand. "No apology necessary, Captain. These things happen." Richards shook his head. "They shouldn't happen. Not to anyone, but especially not to someone who sacrificed so much for our country." "I appreciate that," Marcus replied. "But the truth is, I'd rather be treated with respect because it's the right thing to do, not because of what's on my service record." The captain considered this, nodding slowly. "That's a perspective more people should adopt." As they walked toward the exit together, Marcus added, "If it's within your influence, I'd prefer that Ms. Wilson not lose her position over this incident." Richards looked surprised. "After how she treated you, 12 years of service shouldn't end over one bad day," Marcus said simply. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them." At the aircraft door, Marcus paused for a moment. "You know, when I was recovering after Kandahar, a nurse told me something I've never forgotten. She said, 'True strength isn't about how much power you have, but about how you use the power you've been given.'" Captain Richards nodded thoughtfully. "Wise words to live by." "I try," Marcus replied with a modest smile. As he stepped into the jetway, Marcus Johnson moved with the same quiet dignity he had displayed throughout the confrontation. A man who understood that the true measure of character wasn't found in moments of recognition or authority, but in how one responded to disrespect and ignorance. Behind him, the crew prepared the aircraft for its next journey, the day's drama already transforming into an airline legend that would be shared in break rooms and crew lounges for years to come. For the passengers who had witnessed it, the story would be retold at dinner tables and office water coolers, a rare example of justice served and dignity maintained. And in Washington, D.C., as the sun began its descent behind the monuments to democracy and freedom, a black veteran with a prosthetic leg and a classified briefcase made his way toward a waiting Pentagon car, carrying both the weight of national secrets and the lighter burden of knowing he had met conflict with grace. For in the end, the metal case that had caused such controversy contained something more valuable than mere classified documents. It carried the principle that Marcus Johnson had defended throughout his military career and continued to embody in civilian life, that true authority comes not from position or power, but from the dignity with which one treats others, especially when no one seems to be watching.